When an enterprise loses a key leader, a program manager, or a long-tenured architect, it often discovers that much of its governance was living in people's heads rather than in a durable system, and that discovery usually arrives at the worst possible time. In this episode, we're going to focus on documenting planning processes and outputs so governance survives staff turnover, because turnover is normal in every organization and governance is supposed to be stronger than any single individual. Documentation here is not about creating thick binders that nobody reads. It is about capturing the minimum essential planning knowledge that keeps decisions consistent, keeps accountability visible, and keeps strategic direction from drifting when people change roles. Without documentation, the enterprise repeats old debates, forgets why trade-offs were made, and loses the ability to measure whether investments delivered value, because the original assumptions disappear. With good documentation, new leaders can step into roles and continue governance rhythm without reinventing the system, and stakeholders can trust that decisions will remain fair and explainable. The goal here is to make documentation feel like a practical governance control that protects alignment, value, and risk discipline over time. By the end, you should be able to explain what planning documentation must include, why it matters, and how to keep it usable rather than bureaucratic. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to clarify what we mean by planning processes and planning outputs, because beginners often think documentation means writing down everything that happened in every meeting. A planning process is the repeatable way the enterprise turns strategy into priorities, funding decisions, and oversight, such as how initiatives are proposed, evaluated, approved, and monitored. A planning output is the artifact that represents what was decided and what is expected, such as the portfolio priorities, the approved business cases, the benefit measures, the risk decisions, and the ownership assignments. Processes are the how, outputs are the what, and governance needs both to be documented because both are part of institutional memory. If you document only outputs without documenting the process, new leaders may not trust the outputs or may not know how to keep producing them consistently. If you document only the process without documenting outputs, you will have rules but no shared record of what the enterprise committed to and why. Beginners sometimes confuse documentation with procedures, but planning documentation is broader. It includes the decision pathways, the criteria used, the cadence of review, and the evidence that decisions were made by the proper authority. This is what allows governance to survive turnover, because the enterprise retains the logic of its decision system even when individual contributors change. Staff turnover threatens governance because governance depends on continuity of decision rights, consistent criteria, and stable ownership, and these elements can degrade quickly when knowledge is informal. When a person leaves, their replacements often inherit responsibilities without understanding the original objectives, the trade-offs that shaped the plan, and the reasons behind key decisions. That creates a vacuum where people either freeze because they are afraid to make decisions, or they improvise because they need to move, and both outcomes can cause misalignment. Turnover also weakens accountability when ownership was never clearly recorded, because new staff may not know what outcomes they are expected to deliver. It weakens risk discipline when risk acceptances and exceptions were not documented, because new leaders cannot see what risks the enterprise knowingly accepted and what remediation was planned. It weakens benefit realization when business cases and measures are lost, because the enterprise cannot verify whether investments produced value. For beginners, the key idea is that governance is supposed to reduce dependence on individual memory, not increase it. Documentation is therefore a resilience mechanism for governance itself, similar to how backups protect systems from loss. When governance documentation is strong, turnover becomes manageable. When it is weak, turnover becomes a governance crisis. Documenting planning processes begins with capturing the decision flow in a way that is simple enough to be followed and specific enough to prevent confusion. That includes defining how ideas enter the planning system, what information is required to evaluate them, who reviews them, and who has authority to approve them. It also includes defining thresholds, such as when a decision must be escalated, when an architectural review is required, and when a risk acceptance must be documented and approved by senior leadership. These flow definitions make planning repeatable because new leaders can see how the enterprise expects decisions to be made, rather than relying on informal habits. Process documentation also includes the decision criteria, because criteria are what keep decisions aligned to enterprise objectives even when different people are making the choices. If the criteria are not documented, new leaders will create their own criteria, and the enterprise will drift. A well-documented process also defines the operating rhythm, such as how often priorities are reviewed and how benefit realization is monitored, so governance does not pause during turnover. Beginners sometimes assume new leaders will automatically know how the organization works, but every enterprise has its own governance patterns, and documentation is how those patterns become transparent and teachable. When the planning process is documented clearly, it becomes a shared system rather than a private practice. Documenting planning outputs is equally important because outputs are the commitments the enterprise has made, and commitments are what governance must honor and monitor. Key outputs include the current strategic objectives and how they translate into IT priorities, the approved portfolio of initiatives, the business cases that justified those initiatives, and the measures that define expected benefits. Outputs also include ownership assignments, such as who owns benefit realization and who owns ongoing service performance, because ownership is the mechanism that turns plans into outcomes. Risk-related outputs must be documented as well, including major risk acceptances, approved exceptions to standards, and the remediation plans associated with those exceptions. Architecture and information governance outputs also matter, such as target directions and key standards that the portfolio is expected to follow, because these outputs keep the enterprise coherent over time. Beginners sometimes think outputs are just lists of projects, but governance outputs are richer than that because they include rationale and accountability, not just a catalog of work. The most valuable outputs are those that explain what the enterprise is trying to achieve, why it chose a particular path, and how it will know if the path is working. When these outputs are recorded, the enterprise can continue execution with confidence even when staff change, because new leaders can see the logic behind current commitments. A critical part of documentation is capturing rationale, because decisions without rationale are hard to defend and easy to undo without understanding consequences. Rationale is the reason a decision was made, including the trade-offs considered, the constraints that shaped the decision, and the risks that were accepted. When staff turnover occurs, rationale protects the enterprise from repeating old debates, because new leaders can see that a decision was not arbitrary, even if it is not perfect. Rationale also supports learning, because when outcomes differ from expectations, the enterprise can compare results to original assumptions and improve future decision-making. For example, if a business case assumed certain benefits, and those benefits did not appear, documented rationale helps identify whether the assumption was wrong, whether adoption was incomplete, or whether external conditions changed. Rationale also supports fairness, because stakeholders can see that decisions were made using consistent criteria rather than personal preference. Beginners sometimes worry that capturing rationale will create long documents, but rationale can be captured succinctly if governance focuses on the key decision factors and trade-offs. The goal is not to write essays. It is to record the reasoning that prevents the enterprise from forgetting why it chose its current path. When rationale is captured, governance becomes more stable and less personality-driven. Documentation must also capture decision rights and approvals, because governance depends on legitimate authority and traceability. If a major exception was approved, the enterprise must be able to show who approved it, what authority they had, and what conditions were attached. If a risk was accepted, the enterprise must be able to show that acceptance was explicit and owned, not accidental. If an investment was funded, the enterprise must be able to show that it followed the defined process and met criteria, because that protects governance integrity when stakeholders challenge decisions. This traceability is especially important under turnover, because new leaders inherit decisions they did not make, and they need to understand whether those decisions were legitimate and what accountability exists. Traceability also supports compliance readiness, because external scrutiny often requires demonstrating that decisions were made responsibly. Beginners sometimes think traceability is only for auditors, but it is also for internal trust, because it prevents blame and confusion when outcomes are disappointing. When the enterprise can trace decisions, it can focus on corrective action rather than on arguing about what happened. Traceability is therefore a governance stability feature, not a bureaucratic luxury. To avoid bureaucracy, documentation should be designed for usability, meaning it is easy to find, easy to understand, and kept current through operating rhythm. One of the worst documentation failures is creating large volumes of material that are outdated, scattered, or written in a way that only the original author can interpret. Usable documentation is organized around the decisions and outputs people need, such as current priorities, decision criteria, ownership assignments, and exception records. It uses consistent language, so terms like risk acceptance, benefit owner, and decision checkpoint mean the same thing everywhere. It is updated as part of normal governance processes, such as updating the portfolio record after approvals and updating benefit tracking after reviews, rather than being updated only at the end of a quarter when someone remembers. Usability also means documentation is proportional, capturing the essential information without drowning people in detail, because too much detail reduces the likelihood that documentation will be read. Beginners often assume more documentation means better governance, but excessive documentation can create the opposite effect by encouraging people to ignore it. Governance should aim for documentation that supports decisions, continuity, and accountability, not documentation that exists to look thorough. When documentation is usable, it becomes a tool people rely on, which is what allows governance to survive turnover. Documentation also supports onboarding and role transition, which is one of the most practical benefits for continuity. When a new leader steps into a role, they need to understand what objectives matter, what outcomes they own, what decisions they are authorized to make, and what reviews they are expected to participate in. Planning documentation provides that map, reducing the time it takes for new staff to become effective and reducing the risk of accidental misalignment. It also reduces the temptation for new leaders to change everything immediately because they can see what was already decided and why. This does not mean governance blocks improvement. It means improvement can be deliberate rather than disruptive. Documentation also supports cross-functional understanding because it allows business and IT stakeholders to share the same view of priorities, decisions, and accountability. Beginners sometimes assume onboarding is a human resources activity, but in governance, onboarding is a risk control because inexperienced decision-makers can unintentionally create large governance gaps. When documentation supports onboarding, governance becomes more resilient because leadership changes do not reset decision discipline. This continuity is especially important in large enterprises where turnover is inevitable and where multiple layers of leadership must stay aligned. Another important aspect is documenting interfaces between planning and other governance domains, because planning does not exist alone. Planning connects to investment policy, enterprise architecture and information architecture, risk management and compliance, and shared services strategy. If those interfaces are not documented, new leaders may treat planning as isolated and make decisions that conflict with architecture guardrails or risk tolerance. For example, if the planning process assumes that architecture standards must be considered during funding, that assumption should be documented so it remains part of decision criteria even when personnel changes. If the planning process assumes that benefit realization reviews occur after delivery, that cadence should be documented so it does not vanish during turnover. If risk acceptance thresholds are part of planning decisions, those thresholds should be documented so risk decisions remain explicit and traceable. These interfaces are where governance coherence is maintained, because governance fails when its components drift apart and operate as separate silos. Beginners might not realize how easy it is for governance to fragment, but turnover accelerates fragmentation because new leaders may only see their piece of the system. Documentation makes the connections visible, protecting the enterprise from siloed decision-making. When interfaces are documented, governance remains integrated and consistent. Documentation must also include lessons learned and remediation outcomes, because governance improves by learning from past issues and turnover can erase those lessons if they are not captured. When a governance issue is remediated, the enterprise should document what the issue was, what root cause was identified, what remediation was implemented, and what evidence shows improvement. This prevents the organization from repeating the same mistakes and helps new staff understand why certain policies and checkpoints exist. For example, if a new control was added because a past incident revealed a gap, documenting that link helps stakeholders see the purpose and increases willingness to comply. Documentation of remediation also supports continuous improvement because it provides a record of what changes were made and what outcomes followed, enabling the enterprise to refine governance based on evidence. Beginners sometimes think lessons learned are only for technical incidents, but governance lessons learned are equally important because they shape how the enterprise makes decisions. When lessons learned are captured, governance becomes a learning system rather than a cycle of repeating pain. This learning continuity is one of the best defenses against drift because it keeps the enterprise aware of what failures looked like and why the current framework exists. Without it, new leaders may unknowingly remove safeguards that were built for good reason. A common beginner misconception is that documentation is either perfect or worthless, and that if you cannot document everything, you should not bother. In governance, partial documentation that captures the most critical decisions, ownership assignments, and rationale is far better than none because it provides continuity where it matters most. Another misconception is thinking documentation should capture every conversation, but useful governance documentation captures decisions and their reasoning, not the full meeting transcript. A third misconception is that documentation is only for compliance, but documentation is equally about internal alignment and operational resilience because it makes the enterprise less dependent on individual memory. Beginners should also recognize that documentation is not a substitute for good governance behavior. It supports behavior by making expectations visible and by making oversight possible. The best documentation is maintained through rhythm, because rhythm ensures updates happen consistently and do not rely on heroic effort. When you view documentation as a living part of governance operating rhythm, it becomes manageable and valuable rather than overwhelming. This mindset helps you design documentation that people will actually use. To close, documenting planning processes and outputs so governance survives staff turnover means capturing the essential how and what of strategic planning in a way that preserves clarity, decision integrity, and accountability when people change roles. Process documentation records decision flows, criteria, thresholds, and operating rhythm so new leaders can continue making aligned decisions without reinventing the system. Output documentation records priorities, approved investments, business case rationale, benefit measures, ownership assignments, risk acceptances, exceptions, and architectural directions so the enterprise can monitor outcomes and defend decisions over time. Rationale and traceability make decisions explainable and fair, while usability and proportionality prevent documentation from becoming bureaucratic and ignored. Documentation supports onboarding, preserves interfaces across governance domains, and captures lessons learned so the enterprise does not repeat the same governance failures. When documentation is designed as a practical continuity tool and maintained through governance rhythm, governance becomes resilient because it can survive turnover without losing its alignment, its discipline, or its ability to learn and improve.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.